From fingerprints to DNA profiling, it changed how we catch the crooks. From a pack a day to a patch on the arm, it helped to deal with cravings. And from a space race to gravity-free global harmony, it created New World Peace. They were all inventions of the 1980s, a decade defined by high-tech, in the office, in the lab, just about everywhere. DNA fingerprinting, the Mir space station, and the internet. They were inventions that shook the world. DNA profiling is now the way criminals are caught, an exact method which can't be wiped away. And none of it would have happened without a sharp-eyed British scientist at the University of Leicester. One morning in 1983, geneticist Alec Jeffreys was horrified by the headlines. A teenage girl had been brutally raped and murdered in a nearby village. A terrible tragedy. But there was nothing Jeffreys could do about it. Or so he thought, because at the time, he was trying to solve the mysteries of disease, not murder.
Jeffreys was the kind of guy who did not let anything go unobserved. And that is the mark of somebody who is really paying attention. Somebody's going to push back some boundaries that you haven't even thought of yet.
Jeffreys must have been born with science in his genes. He had his first microscope at the age of 8 and was 22 when he graduated from Oxford with a first-class honours degree in biochemistry. By the mid-1980s, he was working in DNA research, the chemical coding system that makes us who we are. It was still a new field at the time, but Jeffreys and his colleagues knew a few things. One, almost our entire DNA is shared with chimpanzees. 2, only a small part of our DNA makes us human. And 3, it's just a tiny fraction of our DNA that makes us physically different from one another. But Jeffreys was sure that DNA held even greater secrets, and if he could unlock them, it could help diagnose and cure disease. Then, while he was studying a single gene, just one tiny piece of the long, twisted DNA strands that make up the human genome, he noticed something odd.
In the gene, he found a small region in one of the spots that didn't code for any protein.
There were bits of DNA that appeared to have no function, but they did have interesting repeating patterns he had never seen before. Jeffreys realized this could be extremely important and was determined to find out more.
He's a very alert guy. So he says, gee, I wonder where this came from. Are there other sequences in the genome that could match this?
That was the next answer Jeffreys sought. Would there be the same strange repeat patterns in other genes? He took blood from a colleague and her parents so as to compare their DNA. At first glance, the results just looked like a blurry mess.
Come take a look at this.
He was still not entirely sure what to infer from the results.
What do you see?
I'm not sure yet.
But gradually, he began to see distinct patterns in the DNA of the mother, father, and daughter. It began to dawn on him that he had made an astonishing discovery. The repeat patterns in one person's DNA were distinctly different from those in anyone else's, as unique as a fingerprint.
he did use this word of DNA fingerprint, and it is appropriate because just like a literal fingerprint, these are unique to any individual. So he realized that this has legal and forensic potential.
Jeffries' discovery meant there was a new way to link suspects to a crime, and he would soon have the chance to prove that this new science of identification would work. 3 years after the first rape and murder, the body of a second teenager was found. A young man was charged with the second rape and murder after he confessed, but he wouldn't admit to the first murder. By now, Jeffries' DNA fingerprint discovery was well known.
So Jeffries is approached by the police, and they say, listen, we have someone who's confessed to the second murder, and we have his blood, and we know he's done the second murder. So all we want to do is find out if we can also indict him for the first murder.
Jeffries compared the suspect's blood with semen found at both crimes, and the results were a shock to everyone.
And he comes back to the guys and he said, well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is it's the same murderer in both cases. The semen DNA profiles are identical. But the bad news is the guy who's confessed to this murder is not the murderer.
The police were even more determined, so all the local men were brought in for blood tests.
And they make a decision to go about collecting blood from every man in the community to see if they can ferret out the person who's actually committed these crimes.
The police gave the samples to Jeffries. He tried to match the DNA results with the semen from the crime scenes, but failed. But it was not his science that had let him down. It turned out that the real killer had found a way to avoid the DNA tests.
The man who committed the crime actually convinced a friend to give a blood sample for him because he didn't want to be discovered. Months went by, and the guy who had given the blood sample for his friend was talking to somebody else at a pub and said, oh, I gave this blood sample for this other fellow, you know. And that person ultimately reported it, and they, arrested the man who was the criminal and tested him, and indeed it was a match.
DNA matching has not only put many criminals behind bars, it has also helped free hundreds of innocent people.
A handful of these have been on death row, so their lives have been saved.
Even Queen Elizabeth II recognized the value of Alec Jeffries' service to science. In 1994, he was knighted. But despite all the attention, the father of DNA evidence is still working, happiest when he's hands-on in the lab, searching for the vital clues that someone else may miss. Other inventions of the decade. 1981, the stealth bomber. The US Air Force introduced a new bomber that was invisible to enemy radar. Also that year, the first portable computer, the Osborne. It weighed 11 kilograms with a whopping 12-centimeter screen. High above Earth's surface, orbiting the planet, was a giant outpost in space, where it was all global cooperation and harmony. The Mir space station was launched despite decades of competition, thanks to a far-sighted Russian space engineer. In Moscow on the 20th of July 1969, everybody was watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon.
It's one small step for man.
It was a giant leap for the US in the space race. It also had a great impact on everyone in the Soviet Union, especially the space agency Energia.
As a whole, the country was enormously depressed because they were expecting to win. It was a national funk that they were in for some time.
But there was one lone contrarian who was actually relieved that the US had landed on the moon first. Konstantin Feoktistov, who was the chief space engineer.
The moon was, for him, a detour, a blind alley, one that he was just as happy was out of the way now, and he can now do important stuff.
Feoktistov had a much bigger dream, flying to Mars, over 200 million kilometers away.
His own desires was to bypass the moon, to go farther in space, letting people spend years in space and travel hundreds of millions of miles, not just around the block.
Feoktistov had contributed to the Soviet Union's effort during the space race. He had helped to design the spacecraft that launched Yuri Gagarin in 1961, who was the first man ever to visit outer space. In the 1970s, Feoktistov was the head designer of the world's first series of space stations, 9 of them, called Salyuts. They were launched just once and stayed in space, orbiting the Earth. Smaller spacecraft docked at the rear of the station to deliver visiting cosmonauts. They lived on board and did research in this unique gravity-free environment.
They could send crews up to them for weeks or even months. So they were beginning to pioneer longer and longer flights.
But the Salyuts were just 20-meter cylinders, which were only usable for a short period of time, a year at the most. Feoktistov would need something far more substantial to use as a ship for traveling to Mars.
Feoktistov knew that you can't go directly from Earth to Mars. You'd have to build space stations and use those as staging areas to assemble a ship, refuel it, test it out, and then depart. You wanted to build way stations on the way somewhere else.
But in 1976, the political stars aligned in Feoktistov's favor. The Soviet Union wanted a more permanent space station for long-term research, 4 times the size of a Salyut, with multiple docking ports. For this project, Feoktistov would need his best engineers, but he did nothing but alienate them.
Feoktistov was a very intelligent man who was aware of his level of his intelligence, and often people like that rub people the wrong way. So he was not a good company man, but he was a good person to be in charge of projects.
Feoktistov soon had plenty of design ideas, but the challenge was how to build the much larger station. It certainly could not be constructed on the ground and then launched into space.
First, we don't have rockets that big. And secondly, building a station on the ground is a very complex operation. You don't finish it all at once, you finish it piecemeal.
Feoktistov had an inspirational moment that solved the problem. The space station could be modular, built in separate pieces on the ground and assembled up in space. Feoktistov put his ideas down on paper. He planned that the station would have a core module, powered by solar panels. There would be docking ports at each end for smaller research modules or visiting spaceships. But adding these modules to the core, end to end, similar to a long goods train, created a new set of problems. The space station modules could only be latched together, like the carriages of a train, no bolts, no welding. This meant that a long string of them would have far too much flexibility.
On a structure that's large, really large in space, 100 meters long, for example, there is a series of different forces. There's slight aerodynamic forces that try and turn it and twist it. The gravitational forces across this length are different, and they'll actually try to torque it and twist it.
The team had to think again. Feoktistov's second design solved the twisting problem. They would no longer dock the modules end to end. Instead, they dock them on the side of the station. However, this idea created yet another problem. A module docking at a 90-degree angle to the core could result in disaster.
Imagine hitting any kind of structure from the side. You're putting a force, a bending force, into that large structure. If they hit this from the side with too big of a spacecraft, too big a force, you could damage the long section.
Feoktistov's final solution was revolutionary. A robotic arm attached to each module would swing the module around and install it gently on the side of the core module. If it worked, there would be far less risk of damage to the core.
They solved it by saying, we don't have to dock in the side, we can dock at the back end. And then we can use a mechanical arm, a swivel, to take that module and move it off to the side. It was a brilliant, simple solution to what looked like a complicated problem.
It was brilliant, but it would be one of the most hazardous maneuvers attempted in outer space. In February 1987, 350 kilometers above the Earth, the core module of the Soviet space station was in orbit. It was called Mir, which had two meanings, world and peace. However, it was approaching a crucial moment for chief designer Konstantin Feoktistov. The first attempt to use the crane arm he and his team had invented, which they called the robot paw. The idea was that the next module would dock at the rear of the core section. The robot paw attached to it would reach back, lift the module off, turn it 90 degrees, and redock it on the side of the core. It was brilliant if it worked. For Feoktistov, a lot was riding on this moment.
When you're building engineering systems like this novel space paw to move modules back and forth, your reputation's on the line with that. And so if it didn't work, it might be the end of a career.
Everyone at the Soviet Space Agency held their breath as the first robot paw operation began. The module docked at the rear of the core in its temporary position. The robot paw reached around to grab the module and maneuvered it into one of the docking ports. It was the key moment in the process. The project couldn't afford a disastrous collision at this point. However, the docking went as planned. Feoktistov the contrarian proved he was right once again, and the relieved crew members began to celebrate. Designed to last only 5 years, Mir remained up in space for an amazing 15 years and hosted visiting aerospace scientists from around the world. In 1995, Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield flew up to Mir in a US space shuttle.
It felt like I was a tapeworm going through an intestine, pulling myself through this dark place where I'm squeezing through all these flexible tubes, trying to get into the next particular volume of Mir. So it was dark and very constrained, but at the same time wondrous. One of the main purposes in going to Mir, from a decisional capability of the United States, of NASA, was to learn how to build space stations and how to go to space stations. Also to build links with the Soviet Union, or Russia at that time.
The camaraderie on board amazed him.
Here we are, people from different continents, different backgrounds, different cultures, who have come just very recently out of a pretty hostile time in human history, and now being on board this multinational, first great human outpost in space.
Konstantin Feoktistov's Mir was finally decommissioned in 2001. It grandly fell to Earth in a ball of flames over the Pacific. Feoktistov died in 2009 at the age of 83. leaving future space scientists with the challenge of getting to Mars.
Mars is a long ways away. We will get there. It's just a matter of when.
Feoktistov's ingenious design lives on in its own successor, the International Space Station. 14 nations working together in a true spirit of collaboration that all began with Mir. Other inventions of the decade. In 1986, superconducting ceramics arrived, which could carry electricity without heating up.
I have not known scientific development as exciting since the development of the laser.
And in 1988, the intravascular stent, invented by an Argentinian surgeon. It's a lifesaver to millions of cardiac patients. Just slap on the patch to ease the cravings. It was a new way to get a nicotine fix without killing yourself. All because both a team of doctors from Duke's University, including Murray Jarvik and Jed Rose, and a New Mexico professor, developed an identical idea. Psychologist Frank Etzkorn was normally a patient man, but was about to lose his temper. It was the early 1980s, and he had been trying, without luck, to get his wife Sherry to stop smoking. Sherry was addicted to a very powerful drug, nicotine.
And the woman even told me one night, I was getting a lecture for class, that she was going out to walk the dog, and sort of absent-mindedly, I said, yeah, go right ahead, hon. And then about 10 minutes later, I realized we'd never ever owned a dog, and she was going outside and smoking. My wife started smoking when she was about 13, and that's very typical for Kentuckians. She had tried to quit. She was much like Mark Twain. She'd quit hundreds of times. She found it very easy. And she worked at it for a number of years.
Smoking is dangerous because the nicotine in tobacco addicts you to a whole range of other toxic chemicals.
The things that go along with smoking a cigarette, such as the tar and the carbon monoxide, those are the things that are really bad. The tar, that's the greasy brown stuff on the end of a filter, that's probably what causes the cancer. And the carbon monoxide blocks the heart's ability to gather oxygen.
Frank may hate nicotine, but he had found it useful. He had been experimenting with liquid nicotine to see if he could stop rats from other bad habits, such as sugar. In other words, aversion therapy. He gave a lab rat some sugary water to drink. Etzkorn then tried to turn the rat against the sweet snack by dosing it with nicotine, which would then make it feel very, very sick.
Rats cannot vomit under normal circumstances. They don't have the sphincter control of the stomach, and so therefore they evolved this mechanism to avoid poisons. That's why they take small bits of novel food that makes them the least bit ill. They avoid it for the rest of their lives.
But on one fateful night, Frank had an accident that took his research into an unexpected new direction. He gave his own skin a huge dose of nicotine. He then did something that made the situation even worse.
Sort of wiped it, which actually increased the absorbing surface. Heart rate went up to about 180, and I got really, really sick.
Frank was in agony, but he began to make some connections. Could a dosage of nicotine through the skin satisfy a smoker's addiction? Would it be enough to enable them to stop craving the nicotine inhaled through cigarettes?
As I was on that floor, some things came together. I had known about the scopolamine patch that's put behind the ear for motion sickness, and I knew that there were a lot of problems with people trying to quit.
His next step was to find a test subject for his idea. Rats don't smoke, but his wife and his brother John did.
Guys, I need a guinea pig.
Absolutely not.
Honey, come on. Help me out, bro.
Is it safe?
Hey, give me your arm. Just tell me how that feels.
Feels good.
Like maybe you just had a cigarette?
Yeah.
Frank then set about creating a nicotine patch. The idea was that heavy smokers would start with 21 milligrams and then wean themselves off the drug gradually.
So when the person feels right, they go down to a 14 milligram patch, and then the same process down to 7, and then hopefully you quit.
His timing was also perfect, as in the 1980s, the evidence that smoking killed was overwhelming. The habit was becoming socially unacceptable. However, none of this persuaded Frank's college to invest the money to get a patent. Not until he quoted one of his favorite texts to the college president.
It said something to the effect that someday someone is going to figure out how to get nicotine into the human's body without them smoking it, dipping it, or chewing it, and they're going to make a lot of money. And I gave that to the president, and I was funded that afternoon.
Frank got a patent for his patch in 1986. Then drug companies bought the technology and put the patch on the market, and Frank's world exploded.
It was like a bomb going off. I just couldn't believe any of this stuff. There's a little old psychologist in the middle of New Mexico, and suddenly all this is hit. And it was a dream come true. It was the lottery.
Even better than winning the lottery, Sherry was finally able to stop her 30-year addiction, thanks to her husband's invention.
My wife quit smoking, and I'm so proud of her for doing that. The patch worked for her, but I think the biggest motivator for my wife was having a brand new granddaughter, and she didn't want to see her smoking.
An average of 15 million patch prescriptions are sold each year to smokers who want to quit. They don't all succeed, but there's no question, the nicotine patch has helped a lot of people live longer and healthier. Information is now available in an instant. One click and it is immediately sent to anyone on the planet. Global networking means the rest of the world is accessible to all. All due to two curious computer nerds. October 1972 was the first of Bob Kahn's new job at the Pentagon in the US.
Good morning, DARPA. Just 1 second, I'll transfer you.
He had no idea that he was about to change the world of communication, but he was just the type of man who could.
He was and is a very just brilliant man. And in the computer science world, he was always interested in taking everything to the next level of, okay, what happens then in terms of data communications?
Bob joined DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as ARPA. They were not developing new weapons. Instead, they were fighting a long-term battle. It was the time of the Cold War, and the US was determined to beat the Russians in the space race, as well as to stay ahead in every other field of science. Back in the early 1970s, computer networking was the latest hot technology. And for Bob Kahn, working for the ARPA team was a dream come true.
Being at ARPA was like being at a university, actually, so that you could engage in basic research without having to teach classes or fight for tenure. You'd think that everything that came out of ARPA would be, you know, all defense-related and military and you know, sort of Star Wars-like stuff. But actually, it wasn't, which was very nice for the scientists who went to work at ARPA, because they knew that a lot of them would be given free rein to pursue what they wanted to pursue.
Bob also got to use the ARPANET, the first network of computers in the world. It was a very primitive forerunner to the internet. In 1972, there were fewer than 30 members who sent packets of information back and forth, and all were huge organizations.
It really was the first functioning network of computers all linked together and communicating with each other all over the country.
very few could afford the astronomical membership fees.
In order to get a connection to the ARPANET, you had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it was sort of an exclusive place to be.
Soon, everyone wanted to send and receive information by computer. Small independent networks formed all over the world, which gave Bob Kahn a very big idea. What if he could find a way to link all these independent networks to each other? He knew just who to contact to achieve his idea. Computer scientist Vint Cerf from California.
Hey, guys, I have a special guest here for you. This is Vint Cerf. How you doing, guys?
Bob and Vint were both convinced that there was a way to connect the whole world, so computers all across the planet could communicate to one another.
Where do we start?
It was a complex task. First, they had a big problem to solve. Each network was similar to a country that had used its own language. The computers using one network were capable of communicating to one another, but couldn't understand the computers in any other network. Bob and Vint went to a hotel for a weekend of brainstorming.
Okay, that's good. What do you think?
They already had a language that was used by the ARPANET computers to transmit information, called a protocol.
We add this to look at that. That is, oh, that's great.
But it was only designed to work inside a network. They had to develop a new protocol to act as a bridge between networks.
Like that, and then what do you think?
One that could network all the networks around the world. They worked all day and throughout each night. By the end of the weekend, they had succeeded. They had invented a new international computer language called Transmission Control Protocol.
It was this idea of taking these disparate networks and figuring it out a way to put the data in an envelope and take it back out of the envelope. And it really seems like a very simple idea, but there's a lot of computer work going on behind the scenes.
The inventors took their discovery on the road, in part to impress the military that was funding them. They believed this technology could be used on army maneuvers.
So they got a van, basically a bread truck, and they outfitted it with all this equipment, and they drove it around, and they had data traveling between networks all over the world.
They transmitted information between 3 different types of networks: the ARPANET, a radio network, and a satellite network. The question was, could all the data travel around the world through the 3 networks and return intact?
I think that the data traveled like 100,000 miles without dropping a single bit, and that was the big triumph.
They had proved it. Their protocol, TCP, could create a new worldwide internetwork.
All right, Steve, I need you to listen.
However, they had to convince all the stubborn ARPANET members to use it.
We're making the switch January 1st, 1983.
They had to give people plenty of warning because they were saying to people that if you want to stay on the internet, you need to make this switch from NCP to TCP by 12:01 a.m., January 1st, 1983, or you're off the network.
Finally, after fair warning and temporary shutdowns, the old ARPANET protocol was turned off permanently on the 1st of January 1983. Bob Kahn and his team waited anxiously. The TCP was the only network available, but had they managed to persuade the ARPANET members to switch to using it? TCP made it possible for every computer in the world to have a unique address. Networking was no longer an exclusive club. Universities could internet. Soon everyone on the planet could internet, creating a giant worldwide web.
And the thing to remember about the evolution of this network is that it was really just an experiment. These guys were pure researchers. They were geeks. It was, let's see if we can just get these machines to talk to each other.
This team had left quite a legacy. 3 billion people are active on the internet today. Bob and Vince Internet Protocol is still the link that allows us to communicate with one another around the globe in an instant. Other inventions of the decade. 1981, the scanning tunneling microscope, a device so precise it can actually split molecules into atoms. 1982, the Vectrix, the first video game that came with its own monitor, before any child could afford a home computer. And 1983, the new bagless vacuum cleaner from the UK.
Yes, after a performance like that, I think you'd better go.
Imagine swallowing a pill-sized camera that films the whole digestive tract, instead of the medical test that everyone dreads.
Mom, I'm home.
The first giant leap that made it a reality was due to a teenager who had big dreams. In 1985 in New York, Tarun Malik seemed like a typical teenager.
Mom, stop.
But he was not. He was actually a science prodigy with straight A's and a passion for medicine.
My interest in medicine began when I was younger and was trying to figure out, as a teenager, trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life. The science, the research, taking care of patients.
When Tarun was 13, he had a chance to spend time with a local gastroenterologist, a doctor who examined the digestive system for signs of trouble. Tarun was only a child, but he was able to observe a procedure that made most adults squirm, a colonoscopy.
There were some things that entered my mind. This is very amazing technology where you can actually look inside the colon to look for polyps, which may be precursors to cancer, to find them and remove them.
Tarun was intrigued, but he understood the patient's nervousness.
Who, after all, would want to have a tube put in their bottom if they didn't have to? So it's a very challenging test.
The endoscope is a fiber optic tube and video camera that shows the journey through the large intestine on a monitor. The doctor looks out for anything that seems abnormal, such as the signs of cancer. Colonoscopies save lives, but Tarun thought there must be an easier way. Most children would have left it at that, but not Tarun. That day at the doctor's office sent him into the world of high-tech spy gadgets.
I'd seen every James Bond movie about 6 times as a child, and so that part of it intrigued me, the ability to devise cool gadgets that ultimately could make life simpler.
Could 007 help him come up with a solution? During one lesson at school, Tarun was daydreaming, and the idea began to form in his head.
Out of the blue, I was probably bored in physics class is what I think what happened. Not that physics is boring, don't get me wrong, but I kind of got it.
He imagined himself back in the doctor's office, where a patient was given a pill to swallow. A pill with a camera inside it. The camera inside the capsule would do all the work, taking pictures of the digestive tract as it moved through the body.
You swallow the capsule, go to work, go to the gym, take a shower, do whatever you want. It's recording images all during that period of time.
Inside the body, the camera would transmit signals to a wireless video recorder the patient would wear on a belt. At the end of the journey, the pill would be flushed, but all the data would be safe, captured on the recorder.
You bring that device back after a couple of days, and there you have all the information that you actually needed. Presto.
In the family basement, Tarun set to work, gathering the pieces he would need to build his first prototype out of a plastic tennis ball container. After a short while, he had the camera parts sorted out, but he was still a long way off from anything that could be swallowed. The next stage was to scale down the capsule size, which his parents helped out with.
I was a teenager, so I didn't make any money myself, so they gave me the money to buy things and put things together.
Tarun was soon testing a much smaller capsule in a much smaller tube. After plenty of work on his own, he received some crucial help from a family friend.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Engineer Ram Nair.
Here's a recorder I talked about.
This meant that the capsule could be operated wirelessly, and it was just the right size to swallow.
It's for the patent.
It was a long 20-year process, but finally, Tarun obtained his patent. He went on to graduate from Johns Hopkins University with degrees in medicine and biophysics, and fulfilled his dream of becoming a doctor himself. Today, the capsule is being used by doctors around the world to show images of the small intestine, the middle area of the digestive system. Scopes are not able to reach this part from either end. At the front end of the capsule is the lens. In the middle, a battery that powers the camera. And at the rear is a miniature video transmitter that sends the image to a data recorder worn by the patient. Capsule endoscopy hasn't yet replaced the traditional colonoscopy. This is because the capsule only gives a quick glimpse of the digestive tract, with no chance to go back and take a second look. Tarun and others are trying to develop ways to navigate the capsule and equip it with tools to do jobs, such as removing polyps.
We have already developed capsules that can actually do therapeutic interventions on the GI tract right then and there, such as removing polyps, treating bleeding lesions.
It's thinkers such as Tarun and ideas similar to his that continue to change the whole world of medical research.